part 1. All right, these are the steps, the order that you want to look for, or how you want to look for factoring. So the first thing that's listed up here is factoring out the GCF. You always want to look for GCF first. Always look for a number or a variable that you can pull out of all of your terms. The second thing you want to look for is factoring out a difference of squares. So once again, it's very important to know your perfect squares. Another place that where knowing your perfect squares comes into play. Difference means subtraction. Okay, so difference, when it says difference means that you're going to see subtraction here. If it's a plus, it's not going to be difference of squares. And then factoring trinomials is when you have 3 terms. And we'll talk about more about that when we get into those examples. So first, let's look at example 1 and pulling out a GCF. So a GCF stands for greatest common factor. What do they have? What's a number or a variable, or both, that will go into all your terms? So on A, 108 x to the 4th minus 12. So what's a number that will go into 108 and 12? So the key here is, I always just like to start with my smallest number, and I like to see if 12 will go into everything. So I'm going to see if 108 is divisible by 12, and it is. 108 divided by 12 is 9, so 12 is my GCF. So 12, if I pull out a 12, I put it out front, that's my GCF. 108 divided by 12 is 9, so that leaves me with 9x to the 4th. And 12 divided by 12 is 1. You just divide everything by it. And this is my final answer. On B, I figure out my GCF is, so I find my smallest number, which is 7. And I'm just going to see if 7 goes into everything. So 7 goes into 7, 7 goes into 28, 7 goes into 21. So 7 is my GCF. Now, they all don't have an X, so I can't, X is not going to be part of my GCF. 7 is my GCF. And then all you're going to do is divide each term by 7. So 7 divided by 7 is 1. So that's just going to be x squared, 1x squared. 28x divided by 7 is going to be 4x. And 21 divided by 7 is going to be 3. And that's my answer for that one. All right, on C, I'm going to start with 8 because that's my smallest number. And I'm just going to see if 8 will go into everything. 8 goes into 48. 8 goes into 72. So 8 is going to be my GCF, or it's going to be part of it. Now, they also all have an X with it. So X is going to be part of my GCF. All right, so 8x to the 3rd divided by 8x. So 8 divided by 8 is 1. X to the 3rd divided by x. So remember, when you're dividing, so if we write this up here, x to the 3rd divided by x, remember, you subtract your exponents. X to the 3rd divided by x is going to be x squared. So remember, when you're doing it this way, you just subtract your exponents. 48 divided by 8 is going to be 6. X squared divided by x is just x, or just subtract the exponents. 2 minus 1 is 1. 72 divided by 8 is going to be 9. And x divided by x, well, that's just 1. Those cancel each other out, and you're not going to have an x with that last one. And you can also think of as distribution backwards. You know, if you were to work this out backwards, if we were to take 8x and multiply and distribute, you should get what we started with. Okay. Perfect squares on example 2. Factor the difference of perfect squares. So you definitely still look for GCF first. And you always want to make sure that it is subtraction, because if it's not subtraction, you can't do this method. So on A, You want to make sure it's x squared. The square root of 16 is 4. So the square root, so think of it like this. X squared is going to break down to x. The square root of 16 is 4. And then all you're going to do is you're going to add them together, subtract them. Okay? Now, we're not going to worry about, or actually, let's talk about the solving part real quick. When it says to solve, you set each part equal to 0. So x plus 4 equals 0. X minus 4 equals 0. So x will equal, x will equal negative 4, because you move 4 to the other side, and x is going to equal positive 4, because if you move negative 4 to the other side, it's going to be positive. So if it says to solve, that's what you would do. So I'm going to briefly talk about solving as well, but I really want to focus. I want the focus of this to be factoring. Okay, so check for GCF first. So there's not a GCF on B, but if we take the square root of 49a squared is 7a. Square root of 121 is 11. All you're going to do is 7a plus 11. 7a minus 11. So that's what the factored form will be. Okay, now if it wants you to solve, you set each equal to 0. 7a plus 11 equals 0. 7a minus 11 equals 0. We would move 11 to the other side. We'd get 7a equals negative 11. Divide by 7. A equals negative 11 over 7. Here we would add 11. So 7a equals positive 11. Divide by 7. A equals positive 11 over 7. So you're just going to be getting the opposite answers on each side. They're going to be the same. One's going to be positive and one's always going to be negative. You're going to have the same answers. Okay? Now, on C, we've got 81 and x to the 4th. Square root of 81 is 9. Square root of x to the 4th is x squared. Because you just split it in half. That's all you're doing. So we're going to get 9 plus x squared. 9 minus x squared. Now this one's a little bit different because this part is a difference of perfect squares again. 9's a perfect square, and x squared is a perfect squared. So I'm going to bring this down. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of x squared is x. So this is going to be 3 plus x. And that's going to be 3 minus x. So this is the factored form. If I were to solve this one, okay, I would get 9. If I move x to the other side, that's going to be negative. Actually, let's say negative 9. Let's move 9 to the other side. Let's keep that x squared from being a negative. And then I would take the square root of both sides. I'm going to get an imaginary answer on this part. So that's going to be plus or minus 3i. Don't forget when you're solving a square root problem, you got to do plus or minus. Square root of 9 is 3. And don't forget when you take the square root of a negative, that's going to turn to an I. So big review on this problem. All right. So here, 3 plus x equals 0. Move that 3 to the other side. X equals negative 3. And 3 minus x equals 0. I'm going to move my x to the other side so it just changes to a positive x. And once again, remember what I said. You're going to get just opposite answers, a positive 3 and a negative 3. Okay, moving on. We get x squared minus 100 equals 0. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of 100 is 10. So you're going to do x plus 10, x minus 10. And it doesn't matter. You can do x minus 10 first and x plus 10 last. It doesn't matter the order. You're just going to have one plus and one minus. Okay, and you should be getting the hang if you're solving these by now. You're going to get a positive 10 and a negative 10 when you're solving. Okay, on E, now be careful on E. Hopefully you didn't already solve this one if you're moving along pretty fast, if you're getting the hang of it. Notice on E, it's a plus. So this one can't be solved by factoring, or can't be solved by factored, or however you would say that, okay? Because it's not a minus, okay? It can only be difference of squares, okay? And then on F, you got to be careful. Again, we have perfect squares, but notice the X is not a square, okay? So not perfect. So we're just focusing on perfect squares on this one. It can be factored, but it's not perfect squares. We can do GCF. So we can do GCF here. We could pull out a 4, which leaves us with x minus 4, but it's just not perfect squares. Okay, so we could do that. There's our GCF. Just be careful on these because they're perfect squares. 4 and 16 are perfect squares, but the x is not a perfect square. So just pay attention, pull out your GCF and just pay attention to these, okay? But that x is not an x squared. Okay, so let's move on to some trinomials. Okay, so I think this is like where you barely got to in Math 1 last year. And so what you do, there's a method to this. And let's see here. Okay, so when you're doing trinomials, means it's got 3 terms. What you want to do is you always want to set up 2 parentheses, and you want to think of 2 numbers that multiply to be 12 and add to be the middle number, so add to be 7. And a lot of times what most of the math teachers do is they like to go over here and they like to make this x. And they'll put the 12 up top, multiply to be 12, and add to be 7. And they just like to organize it like this. So multiply to be 12 and add to be 7. And you just got to think. Multiples of 12, so like 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Which pairs add up to be 7? And that's 3 and 4. Positive 3, positive 4. And you can even go ahead and put your x's on front over here. So since that's positive 3 and positive 4, you do plus 3, plus 4. And that is your factored answer for that problem. Now, if you were solving, if we wanted to go solving these, now I want the main focus on this to be factoring, because you got to learn how to factor. Because it was skipped over a little bit. Not really skipped over, but because of everything that happened last year. But you would do x plus 3 equals 0. X plus 4 equals 0. Move your 3 to the other side, so x is going to be negative 3. And move your 4 to the other side, so x is going to be negative 4. And that's how you would solve. Okay. Now on B, you can go ahead and set up your parentheses. Go ahead and put x's up front. That's not going to change. That right there is going to be the same every time. Okay. You can set up your x over here. Put 50 up top, 15 in the bottom. 2 numbers that multiply to give you 50 and are going to add up to be 15. Just start thinking of your multiples of 50. 1 and 50, 2 and 25, 3 doesn't go into 50, 4 doesn't go into 50, 5 and 10. 5 and 10 add up to be 15. 5 and 10. They're both positive. So positive 5, positive 10. Now, it doesn't matter the order. I could have put plus 10 first, and that would be okay. And that's my factored form. Now, if I wanted to solve, I'd put x plus 5 equals 0. Subtract that 5. X would be negative 5. X plus 10 equals 0. Subtract that 10. X would equal negative 10, and that's how I would solve. But like I said, I want the focus on this to be factoring. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to set up my parentheses. That's the same every time. That is not going to change in this part. When there's no number up front, that's not going to change. 14 goes up top. -9 goes down here. Now, this one's going to be a little bit trickier because I've got to think of two numbers that multiply to be multiply to be positive 14 and add up to be -9. So two numbers that multiply to be a positive number. So they both, in this instance, they both have to be negative numbers. So two numbers that multiply to be 14. -1 times -14, give me 14. But -1 plus -14, give me -15. So that's not going to work. What about -2 and -7? Those multiply to be 14, and then they add up to be -9. So -2 times -7 works. So -2, -7. And that's my answer. There's also a trick in the calculator you can use, and I'm going to insert a video here, that if you go to y equals, this will help you out a little bit. You got to be a little bit careful because it doesn't help you so much with the negative numbers, but it will give you a list of all the numbers that multiply. But if you hit y equals, you can type in 14 divided by x, then hit second graph. And it will give you a list of all the numbers that multiply to be 14. And you can scroll down and look for numbers, and you just have to think, okay, well, what numbers would add up to be -9? And then that will help you a little bit. It gives you a list, especially when you get into bigger numbers. So that's a trick you can use. So remember that trick for your calculator. Now, you want to use the TI extension on your Chromebook for that, unless you do have your own TI-84 or TI-83. Okay. So on D, set your parentheses up. So we've got -24 and +2. So now this one, we have a -24. So this means that they've got to multiply to be a negative number. That means one of our numbers is positive, one of our numbers is negative. Now, here's the trick with this. Being that one is positive, one's negative. Being that this number is positive, that means the bigger of our two numbers is positive. Let me say that again. The bigger of the two numbers has to be positive because this number is positive. So two numbers that multiply to be 24, +6 and -4. 6 times -4 is -24. 6 plus -4 gives me +2. So +6 minus 4. All right, I'm going to keep going because I want to focus on the factoring. So for E, I'm going to set up my parentheses. So -42, -1. Now this time, okay, so since it's a negative number up top, I know one is positive, one negative, because since it's a negative, to multiply to get a negative number, one's positive, one negative. They're two different numbers. Since this one's a negative, the bigger one has to be negative. That's the trick in this. The bigger one has to be negative. So, -7, +6. Now remember, anytime you can pause the video before I get to this part if you want to try to think of your own two numbers. So -7, -6. Okay. Set up your parentheses. All right, 25 up top, the 10 in the bottom. If you want to pause the video to try to think of your own two numbers, pause it. All right, two numbers that multiply to be 25 and add to be 10. So both of these are positive. That means our two numbers here are going to be positive. 5 and 5. So +5, +5. All right, on G. All right, we make our X. 12 goes up top, -8 goes on bottom. So since our top number is positive, two numbers that multiply to be positive. That means they both have the same sign. And since this number is negative, they're both going to be negative. So two negative numbers here. So two numbers that multiply to be 12 and add up to be negative 8. Negative 2, negative 6. So minus 2, minus 6. And once again, order does not matter. I could have just as easily wrote x minus 6, x minus 2. It's the same answer. All right, on H, we've got x and x. We put our 5 up top and our 1 down below. These are both positive. Two numbers that multiply to be 5 and add up to be 1. Well, the only numbers that multiply to be 5 are 1 and 5. And 1 plus 5 is 6. So there are no numbers, which means this one is called prime. So prime means it can't be factored. That's what prime means. Then we get to I. Now remember I told you in the very beginning you always want to look for a GCF first. Our GCF on I is 2. So that if we pull out a 2, that leaves us with x squared minus 11x plus 24. And now what we're going to do is we're going to factor this trinomial here. So I'm going to put the 24 up top and the negative 11 here. Okay, so since this 24 is a positive, that means my two numbers have to have the same sign. And since this is a negative, that means they are both negative. Okay, so two numbers that multiply to be 24 and add to be negative 11 are negative 8 and negative 3. So negative 8, negative 3. And that is my final answer.